I think about Sheffield Castle about the same amount of time as a man would think about the Roman Empire, which turns out to be quite a lot. Let me explain why. Although I feel like surely men don't think about the Roman Empire that much. Like, is this just something that they kind of like said to each other and said, yeah, women are asking about this. Can we like say that we're thinking about it a lot? I don't know. Like, do you really think about it that much? Like, really? I mean, the Roman Empire is cool. Anyway. Now, when it comes down to the origins of Sheffield Castle, it's unclear exactly when the structure that would become known as Sheffield Castle was first created. There is no real evidence of an Anglo-Saxon settlement there, so whilst that doesn't mean that they definitely didn't build some kind of fortified structure on the site, it doesn't seem particularly likely considering the fact that there is no evidence. So in terms of the origins of Sheffield Castle, we are definitely talking, or more than likely talking, post-conquest. Now, there is evidence of troops being stationed at Sheffield Castle, and it seems that in the early part of the medieval period, so talking post-conquest, throughout the 11th and 12th century and and most of the 13th century, we're talking about a wooden structure being there. In terms of the people or the family that were responsible for this area, we're talking about a family called the Furnivalls. Now, there were two major fires that seemed to take place at Sheffield Castle throughout the medieval period. The first one seemed to take place around the year, so we're talking maybe like the 12th, the 12th century, so around 1184, approximately around that time. And then we've got some more evidence of another much larger fire potentially taking place in 1266. Now, the 1266 fire is really interesting because that seems to take place during the Barons' War. Now, the Barons' War was a really big conflict, the Second Barons' War, I should clarify. There was a really big conflict that was taking place at this point between Henry III and some of his leading barons, for instance Simon de Montfort. There were a lot of kind of arguments around the role and the power that the king had, and there were arguments around whether or not the king should have some kind of council. It would eventually lead to like the first People's Parliament. But whilst this struggle was going on between the king and his barons, Sheffield Castle got embroiled within it and was actually, it seems, attacked by a man called John Deville, which I'm hoping I'm pronouncing correctly, but either way, like, just a really, really cool name. Like, maybe some kind of relation to Cruella de Vil? Probably, definitely not, but still fun to think about. But anyway, he attacked Sheffield Castle, burnt at least some of it down, if not all of it. The damage may have been extensive because of the fact that it's a few years later when the Furnivalls are given permission to have the castle rebuilt, but this time they're going to build it in stone. And what a stone castle do they build? Like, they really lean into the fortifications, and it's really an amazing, well, I mean, it doesn't exist anymore, but you know, from what we can tell about the castle, it was definitely an impressive and quintessential sort of 13th century castle. So let's talk about what Sheffield Castle actually looked like. Now, Sheffield Castle was surrounded by these two rivers that met, and then we also have, so we have the River Sheaf and we have the River Don. We have a moat as well that kind of went around the other side. Now, in terms of the two natural barriers, which again makes it perfect sense to kind of utilize those to protect yourself, because remember, the key motivation for building this kind of structure is absolutely about two things. One is about practicality and defense, and the other one is about just scaring people to defend them that way. So it's very much kind of every decision that is made with regards to this castle was leaning in towards that defensive structure. And we can see that from using the natural resources of the two rivers and the confluence, and then we've also got that moat. Now, again, there's been a lot of debate with regards to whether or not the moat was filled with water. There is later evidence that by the time we get to the 17th century, it was intermittently filled with water, so there was some kind of like structure that would basically kind of like steady the flow of it. We also have some evidence, but again, it's not super conclusive, but there is evidence to suggest that essentially the townsfolk of Sheffield would just throw their waste into the moat, which, for people who are very familiar with medieval public health and Renaissance public health, like, that's not going to surprise anybody. And that may also explain why later on, when Mary Queen of Scots moves in, why she kind of hated it so much there, because her rooms were like right above that area. So possibly might explain why she was so salty when it came down to talking and leaving reviews for Sheffield Castle, but here we are. We also have this like incredible entranceway, which is definitely making like a grand statement. Rhuddlan Castle is a good example of what that may look like, because Rhuddlan Castle of course still does sort of exist, and we can see the incredible entranceway. The walls would have been incredibly thick as well. We're talking like 12 foot, really, really thick. The masonry, like the stonework, was kind of sourced from the local area as well. So some of the stone came from like places like Roach Abbey and places like that. So again, it was just, you know, if you were there at the time and you were crossing that drawbridge, this would have been an incredibly impressive sight, and it would have been incredibly formidable as well. So, you know, John de Evil is not burning this castle down. It is that kind of like sentiment and style. Now, there are a number of buildings that will have been there. So we know there will have been a chapel, there will have been other sort of buildings kind of within the sort of the courtyard as well, which wasn't unusual for the time. In terms of the residential area, we're thinking it's kind of like the sort of the northern part of the castle in terms of, you know, from the entranceway, which again makes sense. Now, by the time of the 16th century, Elizabeth I is Queen of England after a very turbulent start to her life, but she is now that Protestant queen reigning supreme down in London. Meanwhile, in the north, we've got Mary, Queen of Scots, who is having a bit more of a difficult time in terms of trying to control her courtiers and try and keep everything nice and calm. Things do not go well for her. She escapes. I'm sure you know the story. She escapes into England thinking that Elizabeth is going to help her get her throne back in Scotland. She was wrong. Ultimately, she ends up being taken or kind of giving over to Shrewsbury, who is to basically act as her jailer, keep an eye on her, make sure she's not getting into any trouble, and all that sort of jazz. The thing is that George Talbot, also known as Shrewsbury, he is now the owner, a very proud owner, of Sheffield Castle. And Sheffield Castle is the perfect place to keep Mary, Queen of Scots. Not that she would agree with that. She hated Sheffield Castle. Like, she hated it. Despised Sheffield Castle. Absolutely hated it. But Talbot, he thinks it's quite a nice place. So, you know, he's very aware of how Sheffield Castle ticks all of the boxes. It is a fortress. There's only one entrance, so she ain't going anywhere. We've got those very thick, impressive walls that, again, nobody is going to be getting nobody is going to be getting through. You've got the two rivers, you've got a moat, you've got cool medieval stuff. You know, it's all there. It's all totally fine. So, seems to be the perfect location. It's also worth noting that he is, you know, wealthy enough to be able to cater for her for a prolonged period of time. So that's another reason why this is a good pick. The other reason why this is a good pick is the location of Sheffield. In terms of, if you're thinking about kind of like the distance between the Scottish borders all the way down to London, Sheffield kind of falls halfway in between. So again, it's a pretty good place to keep Mary. She's not too close to London to cause any trouble. She's too far away from Scotland to be able to get there easily. So it was the perfect location. Mary, Queen of Scots, arrives in Sheffield Castle, and she would spend 14 years basically in Sheffield Castle, although she does, and it is worth noting, she does spend time in the other houses around Sheffield Castle, so other properties that Talbot had. However, she spent the most time in Sheffield Castle. It isn't surprising that Mary, Queen of Scots hated Sheffield Castle. Firstly, we've got to remember that by the 16th century, it was really old-fashioned. It was this quintessential 13th century medieval castle, which still had all the bells and whistles of a medieval castle. It was not supposed to be comfortable. It was supposed to be threatening and imposing and practical, and Mary hated it. She would have much rather spend her time somewhere like Sheffield Manor Lodge, which was the sort of the quintessential 16th century manor house, much more comfortable, much more kind of in fitting with the fashions of the time. Sheffield Castle just wasn't it. And not only that, but the river flooded a lot. It smelled of stagnant water. You know, like I said, people were probably throwing their waste into the river, so it's not surprising that she got sick. Like, she despised the castle with her whole heart. I mean, even though she's like miserable, she does have a lot of servants around her, and even though sort of depending on what was happening at the time, the number of servants that she had would reduce, generally she was watched at all times. She was not allowed to leave Sheffield Castle. There were guards posted outside of her window, again, to make sure that she wasn't going to be able to escape or get messages to anybody that she wasn't supposed to get messages to. Something super important happens in Sheffield Castle in 1571, and that is that Talbot has a young squire come into his service, and that young squire is Anthony Babington. Now, Anthony Babington doesn't really get up to any mischief as far as we're aware in Sheffield Castle, but being based in Sheffield Castle, where Mary Queen of Scots is kind of helps to explain why he's going to become completely infatuated with Mary Queen of Scots, and as a young impressionable Catholic is going to, when he grows up, decide, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try and assassinate Elizabeth I, free Mary Queen of Scots from her prison and put her on the throne. And that is going to be, you know, really bad for both of them. They are both going to end up being executed. So well done, Anthony. Well done. Now, due to the difficult conditions, Mary, if it was up to her, would have spent her time at other places like Chatsworth. She loved Buxton as well, which, like, who wouldn't love Buxton? So she would try to spend as much time as possible at other places, but again, Shrewsbury was really, really reluctant to, because he knew how good Sheffield Castle was at keeping her imprisoned. Yes, it wasn't comfortable, but it was incredibly practical. It was very easy to keep control of Mary. Now, as time would potentially pass, and he would get a bit closer to her, he'd start to feel a lot more sorry for her. She does start to spend her time at other locations. But still, throughout these 14 years, the primary residence for Mary Queen of Scots is Sheffield Castle. So what did Mary get up to while she was at Sheffield Castle? Well, ultimately, she would do whatever she could to help her servants. She seemed to come across like a really genuine person who would want to help people as best as she can. So whenever her servants or people who had worked for her or her mother would get into trouble, she would try to pay off their debts whenever she could. So that's pretty cool. But she would also keep pets. We know she had pets in terms of dogs. She had birds as well. She particularly associated with birds, and the birds crop up a lot in her embroidery as well, because she very much saw the metaphorical value in birds that were caged, just like she was a little sweet innocent bird that was also caged. She was very conscious about fashion. Embroidery was probably the top thing that she would do. She did a lot of poetry. She bathed in wine as well, because yeah, she's Mary Queen of Scots, like what else is she gonna do? So she had a reasonable time, but she was, of course, kept in one place, not allowed to move. And again, how difficult her imprisonment was would absolutely depend on what was happening in the sort of the 16th century world at the time. So when there were these uprisings of Catholics against Elizabeth, what tended to happen was that Mary Queen of Scots' conditions would get a lot stricter and a lot harsher. Then things would relax a little bit, and then again they would go back. So throughout those 14 years, that was what tended to happen. Now eventually Shrewsbury is going to end up losing control of Mary Queen of Scots. There was a lot of speculation that he had essentially just grown and caught too many feelings for Mary Queen of Scots. So Elizabeth has Mary removed and put into the hands of somebody else. So after 14 years of having Sheffield Castle or Sheffield Manor Lodge, but mostly the castle as her home, she is removed from there, and it is at this point that Anthony Babington and the Babington plot starts to come to fruition, unravel very, very quickly, and then of course Mary has a trial and is executed for treason against Mary, which may have also been one of the motivating factors for Spanish Armada. So there you are. But time moves on, and eventually we get to the 17th century and the War of the Three Kingdoms, more famously known as the English Civil War. Now, Sheffield Castle was held by royalist troops, and it was garrisoned by the royalists. However, it doesn't remain that way, and the castle will actually surrender in 1644, in part because the townfolk of Sheffield are going to help the parliamentarian forces to take back the castle. So the Earl of Arundel actually offered to spend his own money to demolish Sheffield Castle, and it cost him approximately £208, and he received about £225 in terms of kind of the money from the sales, which isn't a great amount, even sort of to compare to other sort of similarly sized castles. So Pontefract Castle, kind of in terms of the revenues that it gave from the destruction, we're talking about 1,700. So yeah, Sheffield Castle just did not seem to get that much money in return, which is just wild to think about. And alas, Sheffield Castle was no more. But in terms of thinking about the site of Sheffield Castle, they do things with the site afterwards, so it ends up becoming like a bowling green in the later part of the 17th century. Eventually it's going to be built up, and we're going to have lots of sort of like factories and sort of like warehouses, and it becomes very industrial, like there's evidence of a weighbridge being there at Sheffield Castle. So the character of Sheffield Castle and the site itself is a really cool and interesting snapshot into the local history of Sheffield. It's also just fascinating, not just because castles are cool, which like obviously castles are just like really cool, but also just in terms of offering that snapshot into the history of Sheffield. So we can see how Sheffield developed and changed from that medieval town with a flourishing kind of market, and then of course the grand Sheffield Castle, kind of a hallmark to the medieval time period, but then over time falling into disrepair, being demolished because of the English Civil War, vanishing and being beneath the surface and then being later discovered by archaeologists who were searching for the parameters of Sheffield Castle and all the cool things that they discovered. And the fact that it doesn't just show us about the medieval world, but it also shows us about the industrial time period that followed, because when the archaeologists have been researching and have been investigating the site, they have found loads and loads of cool objects, not just linked to Sheffield Castle's medieval history, but to the later period as well. So it's just really, really cool. Hey, you made it to the end, to the awkward bit. Thank you so much for watching through this video and listening to my ramble on Sheffield Castle. Like I said, I'm just a little bit obsessed with Sheffield Castle. I find it fascinating, and I would love to dive back in time and just sort of, just to see it. I just want to see it. I just want to walk around it and go like, ooh, cool. But anyway, thank you so much for listening and watching. Please let me know in the comments, like, where would you time travel back in time? What buildings have we lost to history that you just really wish we could go back and see? Anyway, I'll see you soon. Bye.